Hello, my name's Mike and I make educational videos about music production, music business, things like that. Today I want to show you all the different types of tracks in Pro Tools, the different uses for each and how to combine some of them to work together. There's quite a few, so let's not waste any time. The most basic track is the audio track. It's the track you would reach for if you needed to record something, either physically with a microphone or a direct box, or digitally making internal bounces. There's a fader for volume, your basic controls like solo, mute, panning, and the option to record arm the track. This tells Pro Tools you want to record onto this track the next time you hit record. And defining this is important because it's how we say record onto this track or these few tracks and don't record over these other tracks. Instead, playback what's already on those tracks. Up top, we have a few rows for adding inserts or plugins and effects, and a few rows for sends where we could send a copy of the audio to an external effects track, which leads us to auxiliary tracks. Auxiliary tracks are pass-through tracks. They're similar to audio tracks in their controls. They've got a fader, solo, mute, panning, ability to add plugins and sends of their own, but something is missing. There isn't a record arm button, and that's because no audio ever gets written to these tracks. Instead, audio can only be sent to them to be routed through. So what are some common uses for these types of tracks? Well, you could use them as effects tracks, for example. If you have a few vocal tracks that you want to send to the same reverb, you can make a single aux track, add your reverb to that, and then send your vocal track to it, eliminating the need to put a reverb plugin on each individual vocal track. And you can see how that saves time and computer power over the course of an entire project. Another great way to use auxiliary tracks is as routing buses. You can make an aux track called drums and route all of the drums in your project through it, giving you a single point to make changes to all of the drums. That could mean compressing them together, or just a simple place to adjust their volume as a whole. I do this for all the different subgroups in my routing template, using aux tracks for drums, bass, instruments, the rest of the music, vocals and effects, full instrumental, and a final bus where everything comes together as the full mix. And finally, auxiliary tracks used to be used alongside MIDI tracks as a way to output the MIDI track audio, which leads us to MIDI tracks. So now might be a good time to remind you to hit subscribe if you want to learn more about production and music business. Now, unlike audio and auxiliary tracks, MIDI tracks don't store any audio, and no audio passes through them. Instead, they store note information, like when a note was pressed, how hard it was pressed or its velocity, was a sustain pedal used, how long was the note held, and so on. Performance information. This information is then routed to an instrument. In the past, these were external MIDI devices like keyboards or drum machines, and now most of the time, these are instrument plugins. You could set up a MIDI track to record that performance information, and then tell that track to send that information to an instrument plugin like a piano that you have sitting on an auxiliary track. The aux track is how the sound is played in your session, and it's where you would add other effects like EQ, where you would control the volume, the panning, and how you would route it to effect sends, and your mix output. More recently, this process has been replaced by the introduction of instrument tracks, which combine MIDI tracks and auxiliary tracks. They record performance information, but they also have playback abilities. They can take plugins and effects right on the track itself and can be mixed and routed all in one. Taking what we've learned so far, instrument tracks should start to make some sense on their own. They record MIDI information, not audio, and they can be written to directly like a MIDI track, but they eliminate the need for routing to an aux track because you can place the virtual instrument directly on the track. Then, following the instrument plugin, you could place your effects chain and any mix processing you wanted to do right on the instrument track. So MIDI tracks still have a place if you need to route to an external instrument, but if you're using a virtual instrument inside of Pro Tools, instrument tracks are what you're going to want to reach for. So next, let's look at folder tracks. Folder tracks are a recent addition to Pro Tools and are a great way to organize your session by being able to group tracks and collapse a big project into folders, hiding all of the tracks you might not want to see at all times. And there's two types of folder tracks, basic folders and routing folders. Basic folders are just that. No audio passes through them. They're just ways to group tracks and collapse them neatly within folders. Routing folders take it a step further by combining the function of a folder with the routing and processing options you get with an aux track. So now, using our example from earlier, you could route your drums to a routing folder instead of an aux track and have all the same benefits of an aux track, like a place to do broad moves to the whole drum group, plus the ability to collapse the drums into a folder neatly and take up less visual space in your mix. Finally, we have master tracks. Master tracks can be a little tricky to understand, and it took me a little while to fully process what they're actually doing related to signal flow. We can add inserts to them, and so it seems like sound is being routed through them. But if you look at the I/O options, you'll see there's only an output option. Weird. And to make it weirder, this does not select the output of the master track, because how could it have an output without first having an input, right? There'd need to be audio coming in to be routed out. So when you select an output on a master track, what you're actually doing is telling that track which existing output to control. Most likely this will be your main output, the one that sends signal to your speakers, and it's where you could apply mastering effects like compression and limiting. But you don't have to limit yourself to only hardware outputs. You could use a master track to control the output of an internal routing bus. So why would we want to do that? Well, let's say you're hitting the input of your drum bus too hard. And yet, I just said input, but master tracks don't control inputs, they control outputs. But in the case of bus routing, one track's input is another track's output, because in order to feed that track's input, we had to route the outputs of some other tracks to go there. So in the example of our drum group, we have many tracks with their outputs feeding the drum routing folder's input. We can then assign this master track to the drum's output, which effectively controls how much signal is reaching the input to the drum group. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, let's say you're hitting your track too hard and you want to use some subtle compression, but you can't get the threshold to back off enough to be subtle because there's too much input level. A master track assigned to the output of the drum group can be used to reduce the input to this drum group track, allowing you to bring the level down before it hits any of the inserts on this track itself. So it's a simple way to correct your gain staging with one fader. So if you're new to Pro Tools, hopefully I helped you understand what some of these different track types do and how we can string them together to do some really interesting things. Subscribe to the channel to learn more about music production and music business, and I'll see you in the next video.